Bom dia a todo mundo, meu nome é Rafael Groman, sejam muito bem-vindas ao DigiLabour Summer School, um ciclo de videoconferências sobre trabalho e tecnologia que vai nos contribuir aí neste mês de janeiro com belas conferências, por exemplo, com Franco Pasquale, Guy Standen e outros, Juliette Shore e outros colegas que vão estar conosco durante este mês. O DigiLabour Summer School é uma organização do Laboratório de Pesquisa DigiLabour, da Universidade do Vale do Rio dos Sinos, a Unisinos, no Rio Grande do Sul, e tem o apoio do Instituto Humanitas, Unisinos, o Núcleo de Estudos de Economia, Tecnologia e Sociedade, da Universidade Federal do Ceará, o NETS, coordenado pelo professor Edemilson Paraná, a editora Autonomia, Literária e o A.to.B. Hoje temos para inaugurar uma das maiores pesquisadoras na área de sociologia do trabalho, que acabou de lançar um novo livro Reinventing the Welfare State, a Ursula Huws, professora da Universidade de Hertfordshire, e tem um livro lançado no Brasil, A Formação do Cibertariado, uma série de outros artigos já publicados em português, como Vida, Valor e Trabalho no século XXI, como o mundo material, a ignição no motor, e é uma das pesquisadoras mais citadas em sociologia do trabalho e nesse debate muito importante que a gente tem feito sobre trabalho em plataformas. Então, vamos dar boas-vindas, boa tarde em Inglaterra para a professora Ursula Huws. Good afternoon, Ursula. Thank you for having us today, and the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure to communicate with people in Brazil. I have many friends there, but it's been a very long time since I was able to visit. So we have to thank Zoom for being able to communicate so well. I'm going to talk today about my latest book, this one. I don't know, can you see this on the screen? I hope you can see it on the screen. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yes. It's but before I discuss it in detail, I want to make it very, very clear that this was a book that was written in the UK in very specific circumstances, in the situation last year where we had a very important general election coming up, and there were a lot of issues that were quite specific to the UK. And I think it is always the case that any political program is specific to the time and place in which it's produced. And it needs, if you like, the democratic support of the population of that locality in order to give it legitimacy. So I don't want you to think that I'm giving a kind of prescription that can be applied from above in a different situation in another part of the world. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today are very much some ideas based on research that was mainly done in Europe, and possible policy solutions based very much on the specific British context. The book itself, the book draws on two main sources. I'm going to talk a little bit about both of them. The first is some theoretical work that I've been doing over very many years now. Some of it has been published in Brazil now, thanks to people like Ricardo Antunes, who have taken up my work and helped to get it published in Brazil, for which I'm very grateful. My most recent theoretical book is not yet translated, although it overlaps to some extent with earlier work, and it's called Labour in Contemporary Capitalism, and it presents a very specific, if you like, a model, a typology of labour and how labour changes in different stages of capitalism. And the second source of information on which the book draws, which I will also speak about later, is some empirical research, that surveys that were carried out across Europe in 13 European countries over the period 2016 to 2019. In other words, the period just preceding the pandemic, which hit us all last year in 2020. But to start very briefly with the conceptual framing, if you like, I think it's very important to see any development, whether it's a new economic model, a new application of a new technology, new form of work organization, or whatever it is, you have to see that it has a different impact depending on how it's introduced and where it's introduced and when it's introduced. As I'm sure an audience in Brazil doesn't need to be reminded of this, the development of capitalism has been highly uneven around the world. Different industries in different countries are in different stages of capitalist development. And there's a process by which capitalist organizations, often supported by states like the United States or other powerful states in the world, impose models from outside onto developing economies, which distort those economies, but which also mean that you have different models and systems overlapping with each other. In particular, the way that the labor involved in production and reproduction is organized varies a lot from country to country around the world. And I think we very, very crudely, if we're looking at the great history of capitalism, we need to see this as at least up to now, a three-stage process. The first stage is commodification. In the advanced industrial countries, places like the United Kingdom, where I live, where the Industrial Revolution more or less started, you have the process of commodification was a very early process whereby a whole range of goods and services which had previously been produced outside capitalism, by craftsmen or subsistence farmers or whatever, became the basis of new industries producing commodities for sale and introducing the capitalist model of labor, capital labor relationships, if you like, in which labor is the value that's produced by labor is expropriated by capital. The basis of the capitalist system as we know it. Now, in countries like most of, particularly Northern Europe, for instance, that commodification process advanced very, very rapidly to cover a very high proportion of national economies during up to the middle of the 20th century. Not the whole economy, but a very high proportion of it. In other parts of the world, a much smaller part of the economy was directly involved in this commodification process. Very large proportions of the labor involved in producing food, in social reproduction, in providing services, etc., remained and still remains in what I guess we now call the informal economy, outside the direct control of capitalism. So we have very different degrees of commodification in different countries. Now, in the 20th century, especially in the mid-20th century, I don't want to generalize too far, but there was certainly a moment in the middle of the 20th century after World War II when in the global north, particularly in Western Europe and to some extent in Canada, United States, Japan, and other highly developed countries, there was a process of decommodification, of workers clawing back from capital some of the value that was created by the productive workers, creating new kinds of services, nationalized industries, and new kinds of services, which enabled goods and services to produce for their use values rather than for their exchange values directly by commodification. And this was also partly, of course, because of the threat posed by what you might call people use different terms to refer to them, but economies like the Soviet Union, like Cuba, like China, like Vietnam, where the model was a kind of state capitalism where everything was in principle decommodified, and the Cold War, decommodification, as you could call it, in the middle of the 20th century in Europe was partly a response by capital to that Cold War context of fear that if they didn't make big concessions to labor, then the working class would turn to communism. So we had in the mid-20th century welfare state a substantial level of decommodification, but that didn't really last very long, because from the 1970s onwards, with the rise of neoliberalism, you have a very strong countervailing force of capitalism, if you like, capital fighting back, and a recommodification of what had been decommodified in the middle of the century, a privatization of nationalized industries, an outsourcing of public services, a handing back to capital for productive for profit-generating purposes of the activities that had been, so to speak, decommodified earlier. And this process gathered pace. It started in the late 70s with Thatcher in the UK, with Reagan in the United States, and in supported by international violence in countries like Chile, for example. But it gathered pace after 1990, when the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the former Soviet Union meant that effectively the whole world was open for business, for capitalism, and they didn't have to make those deals with labor in the global north that they had to make in the mid-20th century. So that was the situation that we found ourselves in before the financial crisis in 2008. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing this point now is that if you have a society in which there is still, which is still the process of the first wave of commodification is still happening, for instance, in India, for instance, in some industries in countries like Brazil, that context is very different from a context where a new technology or a new practice is introduced in a country where what is going on is recommodification. So if you introduce online platforms in Northern Europe, this represents very clearly a de-skilling and a precarization of workers who are used to having, a standard employment model, who with the normative kind of working conditions, who are protected under the terms of the decommodification deals of the mid-20th century. But if you introduce that same technology, the same company even, in some parts of the developing world, the workforce is not a workforce that was previously well protected. It might be a workforce for whom this is the first time they encounter being paid other than in cash. the first time they encounter modern technologies, the first time they encounter a direct relationship with capitalists, where previously they were in a kind of like a master-servant type relationship in the informal economy. So the social consequences of introducing platform labor can be very, very different depending on which of these three models is dominant in that country. So I don't want to go on about too much, but that's just part of the context of what I want to talk about. I'm now going to move to the results of the empirical research that I've been doing in Europe with my colleagues at the University of Hertfordshire since 2016. And I'm not going to show you lots of graphs. I really I know how boring that can be, especially when it's kind of you may not be all that familiar with even where all these countries are, let alone the details. But I'm showing you these results just to show the extent to which digital apps are now used to manage what you might call a just-in-time workforce across Europe. And these apps are not just used for online platforms as normally understood, Uber and Foodora, Deliveroo, whatever. Because those people who work at least weekly for an online platform are represented by the blue bars in this chart. The orange bars are people who do work for online platforms, but more occasionally, because we know from our research that most people who work for online platforms don't do it as a full-time job. They're doing it to top up an income from other sources. But the people in grey, in most countries, the vast majority are actually people who are in regular jobs, but who are already digitally managed. And as you can see, there are differences, partly to do with countries, but also partly because some of these surveys were done later than others, and there was clearly a very rapid change. But there is one country, the UK, where I am, where we actually ran the survey twice. We ran it in 2016 and in 2019. And what this shows you, the second one, I'm sorry, the arrow looks as if it's pointing to France, but what I mean is the UK in 2019, down the bottom there. What you can see that in just a 3-year period, which is very short, there was a doubling, effectively doubling of digital management across the workforce between 2016 and 2019. And that is quite a dramatic growth. And I think we have to understand it in the context of a very, very rapid restructuring of capital and, of course, hence of labour and hence of social reproduction that took place after the financial crisis of 2008. The financial crisis of 2008 was absolutely had a major impact on the incomes of working people. Certainly across Europe, and I guess in other parts of the world too, because before the financial crisis, people were that wages were already falling in real terms, had been falling for some time, but the effect of the falling wage was disguised by also a fall in prices because of globalization. Very, very cheap goods were being imported from places like China. And as the cost of goods went down, people didn't realize how much their wages were shrinking. Also, there was a huge availability of credit. Credit was really being thrown at working class people. They were encouraged to put things on their credit card, to get mortgages for houses and so on. And so if there wasn't enough money at the end of the month, people put it on the credit card. There wasn't this sort of crisis of subsistence. But after the crisis, suddenly the credit was no longer available. And suddenly also the price of the cheap goods started being less cheap. They started going up in real terms. And thirdly, of course, a lot of people lost their jobs, and or found that their hours were cut, or that they were, they were de-skilled, so they were moved from a more senior position to a more junior position. So there was a squeeze on incomes as well. And this, I think, is part of the explanation for this incredibly rapid growth. I'm trying to show you my next slide. What I now want to look at is more specifically at social reproduction. An awful lot of the research that people do on online platforms tends to focus on platforms like Uber and food delivery workers and drivers, and quite, for quite obvious reasons, really. They're out there, they're working in public spaces. People see them on the street, they interact with them. They, if you're a university researcher looking to do a PhD, they're quite easy to find and to interview, compared with other kinds of workers. And they're much more visible than some of the other platform workers that we found in our research were actually more prevalent. In the research we did, we found that the kind of platform work that is done by most people is work for digital work that you do remotely from your home for platforms like Upwork or Fiverr or People Per Hour or Amazon Mechanical Turk or Clickworker and so on. Just digital work that is done remotely from home, which is very, very invisible, and which is in a global labour market where people are competing directly against workers in other parts of the world. If we exclude those people and look at work which is done near the home, like in local labour markets where people are physically travelling to work, then what we found in most countries, not all, but most countries, was that although there are quite significant numbers of people doing these driving and delivery type work, there are even more doing work in other people's homes, doing cleaning work, doing care work, doing household repairs, doing a whole range of activities that are done in people's homes, which are tasks that are very directly related to social reproduction, and which are tasks which, of course, in the past have been overwhelmingly done in the informal economy, done by people paid, sometimes living in as servants, or people paid cash in hand, people who are not noticeable in the statistics, but also rather ignored by economists and statisticians, partly because they're hard to find, but also because an awful lot of them are women, and women's work, it tends to get sort of blurred. There's a blurred boundary between work that's done by, for instance, care workers or babysitters or cleaners, and the unpaid work which housewives are expected to do for nothing, and the paid work which is done by family members or paid service workers. So for the purposes of this next slide, which I'm sure it's sort of partly rather hard to see, it's quite small print, we're focusing only on the people who work in household services, or who are working in other people's homes. And here we look at both the demand for these services, the people using online platforms to provide these services, but also the people working to supply the services. And again, there are variations across Europe, as you would expect. The orange bars are the demand side, and the blue bars are the supply side, are the workers. But here again, in the UK, we see a doubling, effectively, of supply. Between 2016 and 2019 in the UK, the proportion of the population doing work provided for platforms, this is only work provided via platforms here. Doing work in people's homes went from 2.7% of the population to 5.5% of the population. And this is only people who do it intensively, people who said they do it at least once a week. Meanwhile, the demand went up from quite a lot, from 23.8% to 31%. So about a 30% increase. But what is much more interesting is if you look at this grey bar here, the grey bar shows the people who both work for online platforms and use online platforms. And very, very strikingly, what you see is that nearly all the people who are working for online platforms are also using them. In the UK in 2016, 27% of the 2.7% of the population were working for them, 2.6% of the population were using them. In 2019, it was 5.5% working for the platforms, 4.9% using them. Around on average in Europe, about between 85% and 90% of the people who work in other people's homes are also using online platforms. So what this tells us is something very interesting in class terms. Because if you had asked me 10 years ago how to explain a growth in people hiring other people to come and do their housework for them, I would have said, what we're looking at is a class divide. We're looking at bourgeois women who are able to enter the workforce on the same basis as men, getting a kind of what looks like equal opportunities on the backs of another group of women, very often migrant women, who are doing their housework for them, who are scrubbing their houses and looking after their kids. And this is what we're talking about is a new servant class. We're talking about a new polarization where one group of women are doing the housework for another group of women. What this shows us is that is not the case. What is going on is something much more complex and difficult. I'm not saying, rich people, of course, do employ servants to work for them, although we haven't done deep research on this, but the evidence is that they tend not to use platforms. They use the traditional means for finding servants. But what seems to be going on is a massive, if you like, commodification of social reproductive labour, that working class people are being driven to buy services in the market because they don't have time to do the work themselves. And this is not a new phenomenon. In the 19th century, in the first wave of the early 19th century, even the late 18th century, in the first wave of urbanization linked to the Industrial Revolution, what you had was workers coming in from the countryside, moving to cities where they were living in very cramped housing, where they were working incredibly long hours in the factories. Their houses very often probably didn't even have proper kitchens, and they had no land to grow food or to keep animals, and they were forced to use the market. And what you saw was a lot of working class people who did that, especially married women who had young children, who no longer worked in factories, who they worked in factories when they were young, and then when they had too many household responsibilities, they stopped working in the factories. And what they started doing was providing household services for other working class women. They looked after the babies, they cooked pies, they did the laundry for them. They provided all kinds of informal services, which I haven't visited a Brazilian favela, but I bet you anything that there was a very similar pattern there. So what we're seeing is, if you like, a new kind of commodification of social reproduction within the working class. And I call it a new kind of commodification because it's happening. It's not happening informally, as it did in the past, with women working, providing their services to other women directly for use values, or indeed men. Also, men are involved in this. But what we have is a new kind of capitalist. It's a new field of accumulation for global platforms to enter this field, to match the supply and demand for these services, and to take an enormous rent from them. Typically, online platforms take 20% or 25% of the value of each transaction. And they typically also don't pay much in the way of tax in the countries where they operate. So they're not only exploiting the labor, they're also taking out a massive chunk of money from the local economy that would otherwise be redistributed locally. And that value is accruing on the other side of the world, in California or wherever. So I think we have to see these new online platforms as really an aspect of a new wave of commodification, which is spreading across the world, which is very much based on the bringing of social reproduction activities within the direct scope of capitalism. And I've focused here particularly on household services, but of course some of the other activities that platforms are involved in are also to do with social reproduction. Why do people order food? Why do they order a pizza or a ready meal? It's because very often it's because they're just too exhausted to cook. They're too tired to cook. Their labor time has increased and increased and increased. Their time for reproductive tasks is put under more and more pressure. Their household resources are stretched to the limit, but they have no alternative but to go to the market for things that their mothers and fathers and grandparents would have produced for themselves. So what we're seeing in Europe, this is a very this is the classic pattern. I sum it up in this diagram of whereby which I call the vicious cycle of platform labor. But I think this may not apply in the same way in other contexts. Because I think it more or less applies, but I think there might be details that are different in Brazil, for instance. We could start anywhere in the cycle, but let's start here at the top right corner, at the top left corner rather, where workers need extra income. In Europe, we see it very much as extra income because most platform labor is carried out on top of an existing job. But in some other contexts, it may not, but that word extra may need to be deleted. It could just be a question of workers needing an income, full stop. They may not already have another sort of income, but whatever. The workers, they need extra income, which means they work longer hours, which means there's less time available for housework. That puts a squeeze on the household. If you've got two adults both working, there literally aren't enough hours in the day to do all the housework tasks. And there's often a lot of huge cost is for this this time squeeze that is put on the household is not just paid for in lost time, it's paid for in deteriorating relationships, in neglected children, in parents, people having rows about whose turn it is to go to the shop or do the washing or put out the garbage or whatever. People pay an emotional and a psychological cost as well as a physical cost for this scarcity of time. So you have less time available for housework, which means that in order to just survive or make life tolerable, but the households, even if they feel they can't afford it, they buy household services in the market. They think, there is just no time to go to the shop. There is no time to cook. Let's order a pizza. that the house is filthy, there's nobody to look after the grandmother, let's pay somebody to come in and look after her for 6 hours at the weekend, etc. So they buy services in the market. And that leads in a situation where the old social networks, whereby people found people to work for them through word of mouth, are breaking down. The old ways of finding work through asking your neighbours, through putting leaflets through people's letterboxes, through looking in the local telephone directory, etc. Those are all breaking down. If people want a service, especially people who have moved to a new city or moved to a city from the countryside, the way you find a service is you go to your smartphone or your laptop and you Google it. And if you Google it, what you find is a platform. You may not know it's a platform. You may just say, I need a plumber in such and such a village, But what you get, because of the power of the tag and the way these platforms operate, what you get is an online platform. So the more people buy household services in the market, the more the platforms grow. The more the platforms grow, the more they provide opportunities for work. So the supply of low-paid and precarious work grows. And then the more desperate people are for extra income, the more they will enter those jobs. And so you have this completely self-confirming spiral, which seems to be accelerating at an incredible rate. If you look at that growth in the UK of a doubling over 3 years, that's probably not untypical. We don't have good data from other countries, but it's probably the same in other countries. So there is this very, very dramatic and rapid acceleration of this vicious cycle taking place around the world. And my book was written to try to find a way to intervene, to break this pattern politically. Whoops. And before I go on to looking at solutions, I just want to look at how this has been affected by the pandemic, because the pandemic has clearly had a major effect on these trends. We have seen, as I said earlier, we've seen this huge growth in online platforms. But during the pandemic, some of these trends have greatly accelerated, but some have come to a halt. So it's been like the pandemic arrived in a very, very dynamic landscape where things were moving very, very fast, but it was almost like one foot on the brake and one foot on the accelerator. Abrupt halt in some industries and a very rapid acceleration in others. So, so the braking effects, the things that came to a standstill, we've seen, for instance, the travel and tourist industries at a standstill, which means that platforms like Airbnb are not doing very well, and airlines are not doing very well, for example. A fracturing and a shortening of some global supply chains, which means a reversal of some of the trends that have been taking place, possibly temporary, we don't know. Most dramatically, the collapse of very many small and medium-sized firms in retail, in cultural industries, and other service industries. Oh, there's somebody at my door. Oh dear! Can you? No, I'll leave it. I'll leave it. Huge increases in unemployment. Huge increases in unemployment. And bankruptcies for capitalists in some sectors. There are firms that will never reappear, which of course is the kind of destruction, the creative destruction that always takes place after capitalist crises. But this is particularly dramatic. And the result of all that has been a huge concentration of capital. There have also been the accelerating effects. There's been a huge growth in delivery services, companies like Amazon and, parcel delivery companies and so on. A dramatic growth in teleworking with the lockdown, so many people working from home. As I said again, a concentration of capital, which also means a growth in the market share of large corporations. So a much bigger proportion of retailing is done through very large retailers. A much bigger proportion of delivery is done by huge global delivery companies, etc. And a great acceleration, at least in the UK, of the trend to outsource public services. The pandemic has given our government an excuse to outsource, in many cases, to the personal friends of leading politicians, enormous contracts to deliver public services in, for instance, in health and in vaccinating people and in track and trace applications and so on. So it's been a bonanza for capitalism in some sectors. But what I want to draw attention to is the impact on workers, which in a way actually emphasize some of the things, the trends that were already happening before the pandemic. First, workers are just simply much more likely to be employed by global corporations, with this hollowing out of the middle layer of capitalists, with so many small and medium-sized capitalists going out of business. A much higher proportion of the world's population is working either directly or indirectly, if they don't have a proper employment contract, for very large global corporations. There's also a hugely increased likelihood of algorithmic management and digital surveillance. We know, of course, how Uber drivers and food delivery workers are minutely surveyed using GPS tracking, using a whole lot of other metrics to track their every movement, and that these are designed into the algorithms that manage them and decide how they get paid. But this is also the case for all this growing number of people working from home. There's a huge boom in new technologies for surveillance of home-based workers, for instance, using webcams, to record their movements, digitally capturing the work that they're doing. I don't want to go into detail. There's a lot of work on this, but there's a huge increase in that algorithmic management that we already know was doubling in the period between 2016 and 2019 among non-platform workers. And there's a growing polarization between fixed workers, people stuck at home all day, like me, in lockdown, and the footloose workers who are out on the streets risking their lives, to bring us our goods, and the so-called key workers working in hospitals and schools and other public places, trying to take care of the basic needs of the population. There is in a way a growing polarization between these two groups of workers, but they also, to go back to my earlier point, these fixed and the footloose workers have, although you might think that they have diametrically opposed interests because their situations are so different, but actually they have more and more in common, because the algorithmic management applies to both, and the likelihood of working for a global corporation applies to both. So they actually have an awful lot of new commonalities developing among them, which could, in my view, become the basis for new kinds of universal demands for workers' rights. There's also, of course, a growing financial precariousness and a growing reliance on benefit systems which are no longer functional. I mean, if you look at the United States, if you look at many European countries, the governments are putting temporary measures in place to give money to furloughed workers who are laid off temporarily because of the pandemic. But those are all going to run out. And when they run out, there's going to be a real crisis in terms of support for the unemployed and of benefits. So where do we go from here? This is my last slide. You'll be pleased to hear I didn't want to talk for too long. These are some of the things that I suggest in my book, which, as I said, was written very much for the UK context. I don't want to say that these demands are necessarily the right ones for you in Brazil. Workers in one country might want universal basic income, but workers in another country might very well say, well, we'd much rather have a functioning universal health system, for example. It should be, in each context, it should be the local working class in that country that determines what its policy priorities are. But anyway, these are the ones that rather tentatively I think I've been proposing in the UK context. First, we need a reform of the tax and benefit system. The system we have in the UK, which is very peculiar to the UK, is based on a thing called universal credit, which sounds very good, but is actually politically absolutely awful, because what it does is it encourages employers to pay very, very low wages. Because if a worker's wages are below a certain level, then they get topped up. So it's like a negative tax. So if you if you earn less than X, if you earn 90% of X, then the state will top up through a very tortuous and horrible and demeaning system where you have to apply for it. The extra 10% of wages will be paid by the taxpayer, in other words, by other working class people, redistributed. But what that means is, if you then get a wage increase, it doesn't mean anything, because your benefit is reduced until you reach that ceiling. It just becomes a reduction in benefit. So that discourages workers from organizing through unions to try and get a wage increase. And because unemployed workers are forced into jobs against their will, they're forced to take whatever work is available under threat of losing unemployment benefit. It means that tens of thousands of workers are pushed into very, very low-paid jobs, with a subsidy to the employer, because they're paid a wage which is below the subsistence rate, and the employer takes advantage of the fact that the wages are topped up through this universal credit system. Sorry, that's a bit complicated, but I need to explain it to you, because in some other parts of the world, people think, oh, it sounds like such a great idea. It is not. It's a subsidy to low-paying employers. So in a situation where that is the norm, the idea of a universal basic income becomes very attractive, and because it was something that workers would be entitled to as a right, and it's got a lot going for it. But if the universal income is not combined with other political demands, it can become a very regressive thing as far as working class people are concerned. For instance, if you use a model which is like a model that's often proposed in Silicon Valley in California, for instance, of just giving a cash handout to all workers, it becomes a way of, instead of providing proper universal public services like health service, like education services, whatever, to the population, it becomes like just giving people cash so they buy the services in the market. So it can be associated with eroding collectively provided and fair universal public services in which the workers are properly treated and employed, and which are provided to everybody on the basis of need. Substituting for that a very narrow buying of services through the market. So that's one caution that has to be applied. The second caution is that it has to be combined with a high minimum wage. Because if you don't have a high minimum wage and you give people a universal basic income, you're just repeating the problem that we have with this universal credit system. you're basically giving a subsidy to employers to pay very, very low wages. But if there's a high minimum wage, then that becomes less of a problem. The other problem can be that it undermines trade union and collective bargaining rights, especially in countries like Germany, for instance, and the Nordic countries, where there's a very long tradition of trade unions, of social reproduction services being linked to collective bargaining at the workplace, things like pensions, even things like childcare facilities in some countries are absolutely linked to the collective bargaining situation, the negotiating situation at the workplace. So the undermining of trade union and collective bargaining rights can be a real issue. Finally, a universal basic income, if it's awarded to people on the basis of citizenship, that raises the question of who's a citizen. And there's a real risk, especially in countries that have racist immigration policies, that, the privileged white citizens get their universal basic income, and the desperate migrant workers from other parts of the world who are doing the shit jobs in that society are excluded on the basis that they're not citizens. So it's also extremely important that entitlement is not based on formal citizenship, but is based on actually residence, on where you live. Everybody who lives there should get the basic income. Otherwise, you've got a two-tier labour market. You've got an underclass without rights who are constantly undercutting other workers. Sorry, that may seem rather boring to you, but the idea of a universal basic income is often presented as a sort of like a magic bullet that's going to solve every problem in the world. There are people like snake oil salesmen, if you like, who go around the world like snake oil salesmen used to go around the Midwest, in American cowboy movies, selling this magic potion that was going to cure every illness, and universal basic income is often presented like that. And it seems to me that it has to be absolutely linked to not just to the particular context in which it's being introduced, the political and social and economic context, but it also has to be linked to the political demands of the working class in that country. So the second set of demands is a reform of labour law. Again, this is something which is different in different countries. I think you may have a labour code in Brazil, as a lot of European countries do. In the UK and like many Anglo-Saxon countries, we don't have a labour code. We have a different legal tradition. But anyway, whatever legal framework you have, there needs to be a much better and clearer definition of self-employment. At the moment, most online platforms designate their workers as independent contractors. Although the reality is that they have many of the characteristics of dependent workers. But unless you have a clear legal definition of self-employment, you can't, it's very difficult for workers to prove that they are dependent workers. And but we have to accept that there are people who are genuinely self-employed. There are freelancers. There are people who work for lots of different clients, like journalists, like actors, like musicians. There are lots of workers who are genuinely self-employed and want to stay self-employed. But it seems to me that what we need is a clear definition of what that self-employment is, that they work for multiple employers, that they set their own rates of pay, that they have the right to employ assistants, etc., etc. And we need a definition which is consistent for tax purposes, for employment law purposes, and for social security purposes. But then what we have to say is anybody who is not genuinely self-employed, according to these criteria, is a dependent worker. And then the onus has to be not on the worker. In most countries now, if you, I don't know, if you're an Uber driver or Deliveroo rider or whatever it is, you have to go through a difficult and risky and expensive process to go to court to try to prove, to establish that you are not an independent contractor, that you are a dependent worker. And what I'm proposing is that the default should be that everybody is a dependent worker. If a platform or a labour market intermediary of any kind or an employer wants to say that you're an independent contractor, then they're the one who should have to go to court to prove it, not the other way around. The onus of proof should be reversed. And then once you have this situation where everybody is either a dependent worker or a genuine self-employed person, then what we need is a universal set of rights for dependent workers. I'm not going to go into what those rights are. It's all in the book there. It's not just the traditional rights like, you know, the right to be represented by a trade union and the right to have paid holidays and the right to have sick leave and the right to have a pension. It's not just those things. We also need a new set of rights for the digital age. The right to know what the algorithm is based on, which is deciding whether you get work or not. The right to know what happens to the data which is held on your performance as a worker. The right to have it destroyed if you leave and move to another job. The right to communicate with your employer directly and not via an app. You know, there are a lot of new rights that we need for the digital age, as well as existing rights. So that's another demand. And then finally, what we need, rights are no use unless they're enforced. And we have a lot of countries around the world where they've signed up to all the ILO conventions, you know, and everything looks compliant. But the reality is that there's no enforcement. And what I propose in the UK, this might or might not work in Brazil, is a 3-tier enforcement system. Tier 1 is that basically it's a phone number or a website or both, where a worker who needs information, or indeed an employer who needs clarification, you just ring this number, somebody's answering it 24 hours a day in whatever languages are needed, and you get basic information about what your rights are. And this universal phone number, we have a number in the UK for health services. You ring 111. 999 is what you call for emergencies. You know, if you want the ambulance, if you want the police, you call 999. If you just have a health problem, you call 111. And you get through to this helpline where they have like a triage function. You know, they might be able to solve the problem there, and then, or they might refer you on. And so the idea of this first level of enforcement is they do this triage thing. And then in the second level, they have two more tiers. One is experts, legal experts, health and safety experts who can tell you if a chemical is dangerous or not, you know, that kind of thing. So they can refer you on the one hand up for specialist expertise to existing bodies, which mostly already exist in the UK, the Health and Safety Executive, the you know, etc. They're existing institutions, but the expertise is not available easily to workers right now. And then the third level, which is the most important in my view, is a network of local inspectors who can actually come to the scene and liaise with the local government, the police, you know, if there's an accident, whatever, who can actually deal on the spot with instances where workers' rights are not being respected. So anyway, so that's that one. And finally, we come to the subtitle of the book, the idea of a 21st century form of decommodification. I talked right at the beginning about the kinds of decommodification that took place in the mid-20th century. And some of it involved nationalizing what were utilities and new forms of infrastructure. Like in the mid-20th century, electricity was nationalized. In many countries, airports were nationalized, telephone systems were nationalized. You know, the kind of new kinds of infrastructure that technology had created, that people were becoming dependent on, were nationalized. And I would argue that in the 21st century, we should be looking at nationalizing things like broadband networks, things like social media platforms, things possibly even various kinds of smartphone contracts and so on. On one level, a new kind of nationalization, but on another level, a devolving down to the local level of the use and if you like, imaginative control of platform technologies, because the platform technologies have amazing potential for you know, I spoke earlier about how they represent a commodification of social reproduction. Well, those social reproduction needs are real needs. It would be nice to get them met, but wouldn't it be nice to have them met in a decommodified way? Wouldn't it be nice that food delivery services could be available free of charge or at a subsidized price for people who really need them? For instance, you know, elderly people or sick people who need food at home, people who've just come out of hospital, or providing meals for school children, or for in after school centres, or for homeless people, and so on. The model of providing the food, the food that somebody wants when they want it, could become part of a public food policy. The same thing could be said for transport services, is another example. I mean, I think it's possible to imagine a world where you have an Uber-type taxi services, which are, in other words, transport on demand, at low cost, subsidized for people who need it, but not necessarily subsidized, that becomes, if you like, an extension of the public transport system. So you could actually imagine a world in which people no longer need private cars. Think of what that would do for the environment. If instead of a private car, if you knew you could use a public taxi service with proper child seats in it, you know, to take your child to school, or to take your grandmother to hospital, or to go and do some heavy, you know, some bulky shopping, or to go and visit somebody who lives somewhere which is quite far from the nearest bus service. If it was part of an integrated public transport service, you could create a situation where not only do the drivers have decent working conditions, and people get the services they want, but you could also link it to other industries, to phasing out polluting, energy-hungry types of vehicles. You could actually create new industries designing electric vehicles with all the right facilities, you know, with the child seats and the ability to put wheelchairs in the back and everything else that you need, that are used for public services. That's just one example. Food distribution is another example. Care services is another really big one. Just having a service so that when people actually need somebody to come and look after them, sick people, elderly people, that they get the service they want when they want it. Rather than, at the moment in the UK, we have a terrible system where you get a standard 15 minutes appointments of 15 minutes a day, whether you want it or not. Some days you might need an hour and some days you might need nothing, but the system doesn't allow for that. So I am actually in early stages of discussion, developing some sort of model in a UK local authority for that. But I don't want to go into details because it seems to me it's for every community to develop its own. But I would like to draw your attention to the importance of prefigurative models. A lot of the innovations in decommodification in the 20th century drew very strongly on models that had been developed in local communities, very often radical local communities with a big input from workers. For instance, the model for the National Health Service in the UK was very largely based on the in the town where Nye Bevan, who was the Labour Minister of Health who designed the National Health Service, was brought up in a town in South Wales called Tredegar, where from the 1880s, the steel workers and the miner workers had clubbed together to develop a mutual aid society so they could employ their own doctors and nurses and provide their own health service. And by the 1930s, when there was mass unemployment, they extended this service. They realized that it shouldn't just be confined to miners and steelworkers because there were so many unemployed people. So it was extended to cover more or less the whole population of the town. This is one example of a prefigurative model. I could give you many others, but I'm running out of time. So let's just say, in sum, what I think we should be aiming for, and perhaps this is general enough to apply in other countries as well as the UK, is a welfare state that that is broadly redistributive from the rich to the poor. I mean, this may sound obvious, but the welfare state we have at the moment in the UK redistributes in the opposite direction in a disguised way, but what it does is it redistributes from the poor to the rich. That provides some sort of universal safety net for all citizens, so nobody should fall into absolute poverty. That provides employment rights for all workers, clearly defined employment rights for all workers, and that uses digital technologies, the new digital technologies that we have, to provide social reproduction services to all who need them, and to provide sustainable, locally based, so to speak, green policies for transport, as I mentioned, but also for food distribution, for waste management. There are all kinds of ways that we can use digital technologies to make local distribution systems both more local and more efficient and more redistributive. And some of these, I should say, are already being pioneered. In the pandemic, one of the wonderful things that happened, among the many terrible things that happened in 2020, has been this huge mushrooming of local initiatives where people have seen that government just is not going to look after people. So local communities have come together to find their own ways to, for instance, distribute food to housebound people and to provide health services and to distribute protective equipment and so on in very inspiring ways. And I think we can build on such initiatives. They are, where the inadequacies of the national state are making much more visible the ways in which it's possible for local communities to develop alternatives. And it seems to me that these alternatives, they don't provide the whole solution, but they will help. But they will keep people's spirits up. That's one thing. It's really important for people not to fall into anomie and despair as a result of these terrible conditions. But also they will develop prefigurative models. We can start to learn what works and what doesn't work with these online platforms in order to then campaign for them to become more more widely adopted under the new governments that I hope we will, especially in the UK and especially in Brazil. Boy, we all need new governments. Anyway, thank you. I'm sorry I've spoken for so long. I'll finish there.
Thank you so much, Ursula, for your amazing presentation. It's a good summary of your excellent book. And I really like these prefigurative models and these local platforms. We have many questions to you. The first of one is from Victor Barcelos. What are the potential and limits of worker-owned platforms? And the two following questions is in the same way. What's the possibilities of worker-owned platforms to guarantee minimum labor rights?
Sorry, I've just picked up 3 different pens to write this down, and not one of them worked. Finally, I found one.
Okay, you can answer these 2 questions and so on.
Right. Well, in terms of worker-owned platforms, I think they're great. There are some interesting examples around the world, but I am old enough to remember when there was a vogue for cooperatives back in the 1970s. I was actually quite involved in helping set some of them up. And there are some problems with cooperatives. I think they're marvelous as prefigurative models, and occasionally they work, but they're very, very difficult to scale up. They're very, very difficult to scale up. And I think in some cases, they end up being forced to operate in the market like any other small business. And then they become huge tensions in terms of how they survive economically. You become faced with the dilemma of, do you self-exploit in order to raise some money to invest in some new technology, for example, or do you prioritize making sure everybody has a good wage, but knowing that means you won't be able to expand? You face a lot of the same kind of dilemmas as small businesses. Sometimes if you have a very successful model, then it either gets copied or people try and buy you up, because capitalists are very ruthless. They try and push you out of the market, they try to buy you up. So small cooperatives face big challenges. Big cooperatives are, as I said, it's very difficult to stay democratic, to develop management structures which avoid being very, very bureaucratic on the one hand, or not very democratic on the other. You see all these kind of tensions, but mainly they a lot of the advantages that can be achieved through worker-run platforms can only be achieved at a certain level of scale. And one of the big problems with online platforms is the network effect. I mean, there are lots of alternatives, for example, to Airbnb for renting out houses. And indeed, a lot of them are used as a way to get around restrictions. In London, for example, you're only allowed to rent out a room for 90 days a year through Airbnb, and after that there's a cutoff. So people then use other platforms, for the rest of the year. So they're used as a way around. But generally speaking, the network effect is so strong that once you're Uber, and everybody knows Uber. You've got the Uber app on your phone. Everywhere you go in the world, Uber, you use Uber, and other companies are driven out simply by the scale of the network effect of Uber. It's the same with Airbnb. In your own city, you might know an alternative way to rent a room, but if you're traveling, you go to Airbnb because you think it's the best known platform. That's where the biggest choice of houses will be, same, you think that Uber will have the biggest choice of drivers. There are 3 or 4 platforms, driver platforms in London right now, but if you talk to the drivers, they all say they get more work through Uber than any. Most of them are on all the platforms. They get more work through Uber simply because, you know, Uber's the well-known one. So, but if instead of focusing, if you're focusing on the local level, that network effect doesn't matter so much in terms of sort of penetration outside the city. What matters is, so to speak, market share in that city. And it seems to me, if you want to, especially if you want to integrate with existing public services, if you want to take advantage of the scope that a municipal government has for redistribution, then working either in partnership with the municipality or with the municipality is a much, much better way to go. For example, if the municipality has the right to subsidized childcare for single parents, for example, then if you had a platform providing childcare services and you did that in partnership with the city, then you'd be able to provide the cheap childcare for the people who really need it in a much more kind of seamless way. And the same with, if you really wanted to integrate a taxi service with the public transport system, ideally, you don't want to set it up in competition with public transport. You want an integrated system. You want people to use the public buses and trains wherever they can, because that's much better for the planet and it's much cheaper. And what you want is a taxi service that complements that. So if you need to get to the station to get the train, you use the platform. Or if you need to get to a hospital which isn't near a station, you use them, etc. So it seems to me that, so there's an advantage, there's a kind of efficiency advantage in being integrated with the local, with the municipality or other local body. But there's also a huge democratic advantage. It means that you're kind of answerable. It means that local citizens actually have the right to have a say in what form that service takes. And to me, that's very, very important. That it could be in the manifesto of a particular politician that what they want to do is to expand this particular service, and people would have the chance to vote for that. And so it's a part of the local political process, which is also a process of empowering people. And of course, trade unions need a say in all this. Because if you try and introduce a public platform without the involvement of public sector trade unions, then they're going to be hostile to it. They're going to see it as a way of undercutting them, and undermining the wages and conditions of the existing public sector workers. So it's really important to have everybody on board if you want to develop a successful local policy. I've seen an awful lot, especially in the United States, people who see co-ops as the main solution. And that might be because they don't have much of a tradition of municipal socialism. But it seems to me that they're aiming too low. What they're doing is they're proposing really quite small initiatives, which might sort of survive. It's like, if you live in a hipster area of a big town, the health food store will survive, the local health food store, or the local Montessori creche, or whatever, because you've got that nice little local community that supports it. But it seems to me that we need to think bigger than that, and that the people whose needs we're addressing are the working, the broader working classes, not just little hipster enclaves, however attractive the hipster enclaves may be to live in.
Great, amazing. I love this hipster approach. Two questions. The first one is from Andriele Nascimento. How could provide public policies to workers who are too much exploited and they don't have access to the basic job rights? And the second from Nelson Prata, how to provide universal public service in Global South countries.
Right. Sorry, I'm just writing this down. First of all, this question of providing, protecting the rights of highly exploited, precarious workers. I mean, this is a very old problem that the working class has had to address since it has existed, really. And there's a kind of tension, I would say, in the history of working class movements around this question, because you need two things. On the one hand, working class movements have been built on the strength of organized workers who are powerful enough to be able to withdraw their labor, and have a strike, bring the employer to the negotiating table, close something down unless something is done. And the working class as a whole needs these organized workers to take the lead in the struggle. But on the other hand, there will always be you might want to call it the reserve army of labor, what Marx called it, or Lumpenproletariat, or underclass, or whatever you want to call it. There will be always workers who are not able to organize, whose situation is so precarious or so fragmented or so hidden that they can't find each other, they can't organize, or their skills are so generic that they can be substituted for each other always. And classic examples of such workers, I would say, are cleaning workers, for instance, women cleaning workers who historically have had an awful lot of trouble organizing. And if you look at the wave of general trade unionism in the late 19th century in the UK that Karl Marx and Engels and Marx's daughter were heavily involved in, they managed to organize the dockers in East London. They managed to organize factory workers. They didn't manage to organize the tens of thousands of domestic workers who were, working in people's kitchens and so on. And so it seems to me you need a two-step process. There is the role of the trade unions, which is crucially important in fighting for what you might call vanguard workers, establishing standards, blueprints, things to aim for, agitating, raising awareness. But then you also need political parties to generalize those demands hand in hand with the trade unions so that they affect the whole working class. And historically, this has been done rather more successfully for male workers than for women workers. Women workers have often been left out of the social democratic demands, partly because the mid-20th century and indeed the 19th century social democratic man thought that women shouldn't be working at all out in the labour market, that they should be at home, looking after their families, and that the men should be earning a family wage. So it seems to me you've got to do both. And it's a difficult balancing act. It's not enough to take the kind of syndicalist approach that just says all you have to do is organize and win, and then it'll be fine. And there have been examples of platform workers organizing, that some of the most celebrated have been food delivery workers. I think some of them, the victories have been kind of exaggerated a little bit, because very often you find that, for instance, the Foodora workers in Berlin, the Deliveroo workers in Berlin organized quite successfully, and Deliveroo just pulled out of Berlin. And you find other, you see in the literature that there was this great victory for food delivery workers in such and such a city. And then I think in Argentina this happened. Then you go back a year later and nobody's heard of it, because there's such a high turnover among the workers. People don't even know that union existed. But even if they were successful, even if they did achieve a really, really good deal for food delivery workers, there's a risk that would just create food delivery workers as a new kind of relatively elite group of workers who have a bargaining position in the same way that, you know, auto workers have a bargaining position or public sector workers have a bargaining position. They wouldn't necessarily take along with them all the other platform workers who don't have such a good bargaining position. So this is why we need universal rights. We won't get the universal rights without organized trade unions. We need them, we really do, and we need solidarity with them. But on their own, they can't do it, in my rather old-fashioned opinion, without the partnership of political parties that represent working people. Sorry, the second question was about, I hadn't written it down properly. It was about how do we, in the global south, how do we...
Yeah. How to provide a universal public service in digital platforms in developing countries, in global south countries.
Well, this is really not for me to preach from Europe to you. It's for you to work out. But it seems to me that there are some very interesting things going on. India is quite an interesting example, but it's not unique. There are things going on in Indonesia, in many other countries in the global south, and of course including Brazil. Platforms are developing very, very quickly, and a lot of them are actually local platforms. They are not American or indeed Chinese platforms. They are, you know, in India you've got Indian platforms. In Brazil, I'm guessing you have Brazilian platforms as well as some of the well-known international ones, especially in household services. Global capitalists have been rather unsuccessful in launching household services platforms. Platforms like TaskRabbit and Helpling were launched with a lot of fanfare, saying that they were going to be these global cleaning platforms. But in fact, they haven't been very successful. And the reason they haven't been very successful is that cleaners, especially, and other household workers, are desperately looking. They don't want one-off gigs. They want a steady relationship with the same household where they go every Wednesday morning or every Friday afternoon or whatever it is. They want a regular relationship with a client. So they're always trying to use the platform to try and find a so-called off-platform relationship. And for that reason, that's one of several reasons, that the household platforms haven't been very successful, and so they're more likely to be local than some of the other platforms. But I think how you have to see them is much more as something which has a complicated and blurred relationship with the existing informal economy. So it seems to me that you have to look at whatever forms of community organization already exist among, for instance, among cleaning workers. A lot of the attempts to organize low-paid, especially cleaning workers in London over the years have involved trade unions working not on their own, trying to recruit the workers, but working very, very closely with organizations that are, so to speak, cultural organizations. Most cleaning workers in London are from immigrant communities of one sort or another. And there was a very successful campaign to try to raise the minimum wage. It was called the London Living Wage Campaign. And the unions they worked with, they went into mosques, they went into Hindu temples, they went into Polish Catholic churches. They went basically wherever the people in these communities gathered, they went there and worked with the community organizations to build organizations that were networked in with the other forms of organization that these workers had. And interestingly enough, where they were particularly successful. And if you look globally, if you look at the few countries where cleaning workers have successfully organised, it's nearly always been linked to a broader political campaign. So in London, they were very, very successful in the Filipino community at a time when there was a lot of political organising going on among Filipino women in the Philippines. There were a series of strikes in free trade zones in the Philippines in the 1980s and 1990s. And that political awareness and networking spread right throughout the Filipino diaspora around the world. So Filipino workers in London were very, very well organised compared with workers of other origins, although they were doing this this very isolated, precarious work in people's homes. It's the same if you look in South Africa. You know, domestic workers organised quite successfully in South Africa, but that was very much linked to the anti-apartheid movement. So I think you have to look at broader political campaigns to see how to organise workers. But having said that, I have to tell you, you probably won't like me saying this, but an awful lot of the cycle delivery workers in London are Brazilian. And according to people I know who are very active in organising among cycle delivery workers, an alarmingly high proportion of them are Bolsonaro supporters. And they are quite resistant to the idea of trade unions. But anyway, that's just an anecdote. So, I think generally speaking, it's, you know, you can't just find a syndicalist solution. The world isn't like that. It needs to be part of a broader political program.
Great, amazing. The books from Callum Kant, Writing for Deliveroo, it's amazing about the Brazilian participation in delivery workers organization in London. So the round of questions. The first one is from Rafael Stuckey. Ursula, how do you understand the inclusion and participation of the platform workers' perspective in the production of academic knowledge and in the construction of public policies? The second, what are the gaps in platform work research, and how can we Brazilian researchers contribute to this? And the final question, in what ways can we researchers on work help to collaborate with public policies in relation to digital platforms?
Well, those are quite connected in a way, those questions, aren't they? So I think, I mean, these are quite big questions. I'm sorry to refer to my age, but I started off in the early 70s as a trade unionist. And during that period, before I started doing academic research myself, I was very much a trade union activist, working in the publishing industry with warehouse workers and print workers, as well as publishing workers. And this was a period like now when Marxism was fashionable among young academics. It goes in and out of fashion. There was a long but hard period in between when it was very much out of fashion. And if you were a self-proclaimed Marxist, it was quite hard to get a job in academia. But during that period, there was a lot of interest by among academics in trade union struggles and in workers' struggles, and quite a lot of academics or potential future academics, when it was students, used kind of, I guess you'd call it now, participant observation methods of doing their research. And in those days, they went and worked in auto factories, or they went and worked on building sites, or these were the kind of jobs it was easy to get. And if you read the labour sociology of the 70s, it's very much based on Hugh Bainan. I think it's quite well known in Brazil, is a very classic example of who wrote that book, Working for Fords. You know, he went to work in the Ford factory, and there was quite a large literature of some of it very interesting and adding a lot to labour sociology, based on these kind of experiences. For women researchers, the possibilities of doing these kind of jobs were less, but nevertheless there were studies like people like Anna Pollitt and you know, women who got factory jobs and wrote about it. But as somebody who is on the receiving end of advice from this new generation of Marxist scholars, it was quite complicated. It was quite a difficult situation. We had, I was involved in. I worked for a company that was a subsidiary of a big American publishing company via an English subsidiary, and it turned out that. There was some tax stuff. Anyway, our company was very, very suddenly closed down. We were all told on Friday not to come to work the next Monday. That was it. And we did what quite a few workers did in the 70s. We occupied the building. And it was quite difficult because it was quite a small organisation, and quite a lot of people weren't even employees. We were on casual contracts, and several were women with small children. But nevertheless, we occupied this building, and we had an occupation which was sort of partly successful. We had the support. We were doing educational film strips for schools, and the workers in the film laboratory supported us by refusing to process the films and so on. We had some support, but we used to get all these Marxist guys, you know, coming visiting the occupation and lecturing us on what to demand, and some of it was terribly simplistic and crude. There was, you know, it was very fashionable to apply the Trotsky's transitional demands, you know, nationalisation under workers' control, sliding scale of wages, etc. And because it was time of high inflation, and they would just sort of come along and say, this is what you had to demand, and not listen to our experiences of how actually the sliding scale of wages didn't work when we tried to negotiate it. And I could give you the reasons now, but it would take me all afternoon to tell you. And I remember one guy saying, well, what you should be demanding is workplace creches for your children. I know about working women, he said. I know what you need is workplace creches. And we said, well, actually, maybe isn't it better to have a municipal creche, and then you're not tied to that employer, and you can go and work somewhere else and not lose your place in the creche. And it also means that the father and the mother can equally, you know, use it. And he said, no. What you need is workplace creches. I know. He said, what do you know about being a working woman? He's actually said to me, you know, so there is this kind of arrogance. There is, which is not usually conscious, but I think academics have to be terribly, terribly sensitive to that and not tell workers what they want. It's the workers themselves who know what they want, and it's workers themselves who are putting their livelihood on the line if they take a strike. If you've got a lectureship in a university or a PhD scholarship, it's all very well to go along and speak at a meeting and say, oh, let's all go on strike, or even if you've just got a rich parents. But to say that to other people whose full future livelihood is at stake, it seems to me that there's a big ethical problem with that, as well as a political problem. And I think for academics who, you know, want to change the world for all sorts of good reasons, to just go into a situation thinking that they know the answers and taking a kind of Leninist approach to sort of leading the struggle, I think they can unwittingly do an awful lot of damage, actually. I think I think there are both ethical and scientific problems in doing research in that kind of a way, and I hope I'm not sounding too negative here. I don't want to point fingers at anybody, but I think partly it's the impatience of youth. I think young people want quick solutions, and they want easy solutions, and they want a line. They want a program. Once they've decided what the line is, then that's the answer. You don't have to think about the problem anymore if you know what the solution is. And it seems to me that we need a lot more modesty and humility. And the role of the intellectual is not to tell workers what to think or what to do, but to just do a little bit of research on their behalf to help them understand, what the capitalists are up to, how they're operating, to sort of not only to give them clues as to what might be coming around the corner, but also to give them clues about how to identify which other workers might be going through the same thing, with whom you can form alliances.
Thank you very much, Ursula. Your presentation and your provoking the debates are amazing. We had more than 100 people watching us in this Brazilian morning. And thank you so much for your virtual presence here in Brazil. E aí eu vou avisar para todo mundo que a lista de presença já está no chat, e a gente se encontra na nossa próxima reunião, a próxima conferência do DigiLabour Summer School, com uma das figuras mais polêmicas dos últimos tempos nesse tema, que é o professor Christian Fuchs, na segunda-feira, às 16h, sobre a economia política marxista do trabalho digital. Ursula, thank you very much for your patience and for your time.
Thank you. Obrigada.
Um abraço, gente. A gente se vê. Espero que vocês tenham gostado. Um abraço, até segunda-feira.
Thanks.